That's a great start. Everybody just went quiet. I didn't need to say anything. Good evening, everyone. I'm Angus Harley. I'm the director of the New Forest Heritage Centre just across the car park. It's lovely to see so many of you this evening, and a particular namaste and salam to our friends from the Bournemouth South Asian community and also members of the Southampton South Asian community. So you're all very, very welcome. I hope some of you have had a chance to see our Red Pepper, Black Pepper exhibition at the Heritage Centre. It's the result of a fantastic collaboration between ourselves at the Heritage Centre, Nick Saunders, the researcher of most of the content in the exhibition. The exhibition itself would not have been possible without the help of Arts Council England through Culture in Common. And it certainly wouldn't have been possible to put the exhibition on without Devanshi Runkta, a brilliant young designer who's sitting over here and deserves huge amounts of credit. Like so many stories, there's always a bigger picture. And I asked Shrabani Basu to come and talk to us this evening about that much, much bigger picture. To my delight, she said yes. Shrabani is a journalist and Sunday Times best-selling author. Her books include the critically acclaimed The Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer, For King and Another Country, which is an outstanding book. I've recently finished reading it myself. There are only 9 copies available for sale this evening, so it's going to be interesting to see how you all form up for those copies. She also wrote Victoria and Abdul, the true story of the Queen's closest confidant, which became a major film. Some of you may have seen that. And she also wrote Spy Princess, The Life of Noor Inayat Khan. Some of you may know that Noor trained as an SOE agent at Bewley just down the road in the Second World War. Shrabani is also the founder and chair of the Noor Inayat Khan Memorial Trust, which campaigned for a memorial for the World War II heroine in London. It was unveiled by Princess Anne in 2012. She's a frequent commentator on radio and television on Indian history and empire. She's an ambassador for the RAF Museum, and she's on the advisory panel of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for a project to commemorate the forgotten soldiers from India and Africa in the First World War. In 2024, she was awarded an honorary doctorate for literature by the University of London. The Chancellor of the University, Princess Anne, bestowed with her the honour. She was described in the citation as a thought leader on India and empire. Shrabani, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Shrabani's going to talk for, well, I asked her how long she might like to talk for, and she said, well, I'm very used to audiences, and I'll be able to tell if they're getting bored. So I think, if you're all looking as if you're interested, she will talk for about 45 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be lots of really good questions for half an hour or so after that. And then she will, for the first 9 lucky people, be very happy to sign a book here in the corner. So without any further ado, Shrabani, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Angus, for that lovely introduction. Oops, we have an echo. Are we okay? Yes. And thank you all. Thank you, Devanshi, for that beautiful exhibition as well. All of you, I recommend it highly. Do go and see it. It's full of little gems and little stories. And that's what really makes, that's what brings the story alive. So if you haven't seen it yet, do go see it. And thank you all for coming on this slightly drizzly Thursday to listen to stories from the trenches. Today I thought I'd give a little overview of the war as to why most people didn't know that Indians had come here for the war. So why did they come? What happened? What conditions they faced? It'll be a little run through history in a way. And first I'm going to wind the clock back because, we're going to go back to 1914, to a summer day, August. It's the 4th of August. And the Prime Minister of the time, Lord Asquith, he was pacing up and down and he was looking at his watch and he is waiting for Big Ben to strike 11 because 11 in London time was 12 a.m. in Europe. And at 12 a.m., the deadline for Germany to withdraw from Belgium would pass, and then Britain would be at war. So, of course, as we all know, the Germans didn't leave Belgium, and 4th of August, Britain was at war. Now, thousands of miles away, the Indian Empire was asleep. You know, it was the middle of the night for them. And night turned to day, and when they woke up, they found that they too were at war. It was not a war of their making, but they were, they were a colony and they were at war. So here we are. So these are the posters to recruit the men. And as you can see, Lord Kitchener, who was the War Minister at that time, he put out, he knew that he needed 100,000 men, boots on the ground, 100,000. And he knew that this 100,000 would not be enough. They needed men from the empire. And who was going to give them the biggest volunteer force? It was their biggest colony, India, because there was already a standing army. So you can see this poster, Answer to the Call. And Lord Hardinge then announces that he's received a message from the Maharajas that they are all backing this war. So they will send their troops and their money and their ambulances. So it's all good news. There's a lot of, at this time, the spirits are, sort of very energized. They're going to war. It's a different climate. So here we have some more posters. Rally around the flag, join the army. Again, more posters. Soldiers of the king, you can see the men in the turbans. It was the whole idea was to get the empire, all the colonies come together and we fight this war together. I find this poster, which was done in Urdu, as you can see, I find it quite chilling because as you can see what it says, who will have this? Uniform, rifle, money. You can if you enlist. And these were distributed. So they were trying to get them from, every angle. And they needed these men to come. So a little bit about the Indian Army at this time. As I said, it was a large standing army already there. But it had been restructured. And the restructure had happened after 1857, which some of you might know was the cutoff year. It was the Indian Mutiny, which is known in various terms as the Indian Mutiny or the First War of Indian Independence, looking at whichever way you look at it. But General Roberts, after the mutiny, he decided to restructure the army in India. And he sort of went with the martial races, what he called, and I put this in quotes, the martial races. He decides that the martial races are those who are from the north of India, the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, the men from Rajasthan, northwest frontier. And he says that we don't want the effeminate Madrasis, the men from the south. And we don't want, and of course, they didn't want the Bengalis, the men from Bengal, because they were the ones who'd started the mutiny. So he didn't want them. The Sikhs, the Gurkhas, had been loyal during the mutiny. They were strong, good soldiers. So they were classed as the martial races, and that's what they wanted to recruit. But he also had his eye on these soldiers from India. They're the Garhwal regiment. He starts this Garhwal regiment. Now, who are these Garhwalis? So this is Lord Hardinge. He's the Viceroy of India. The Garhwalis were men from the hills of India, and they looked very much like the Gurkhas, but they were, from just north of Delhi, from the region of Garhwal. And he builds this Garhwal regiment. And I'm going to talk about this regiment because some of the men from this regiment went on to win Victoria Crosses. So he builds a cantonment in the hill station of Lansdowne. And you'll see this marked in the map at the exhibition because this is where some of the men came from. Now, who were these Garhwalis? And I'm showing you this section to show you how these men were recruited. Now, the Garhwalis were simple men from the hills. They tended their goats, they owned small farms, and this is what they look like. Now, years of walking in the hills, carrying these loads of firewood, had made them strong. And in the files, they are actually classified as men with strong arms and strong legs. And that's why they're needed. They're also classified as the raw stock. So this is what they called. It's literally labeled as the raw stock. But this raw stock is going to be soon enlisted. So what do they need? They have to have haircuts, tidy up, uniforms, and suddenly they are transformed into the men from the Garhwal Rifles Regiment. Well, two of the Garhwalis from the hills, would go on to win Victoria Crosses. Their names are Darwan Singh Negi and Gabbar Singh Negi, and I'll tell you their stories as we go along. Apart from the Garhwalis, we had the Pathans. Now, the Pathans are from the northwest, so the border with Afghanistan, they're from the northwest of India. And among the Pathans, we had two people who also won, two soldiers who were awarded the Victoria Cross. So we have Khudadat Khan and Mir Dast, and once again, I'll tell you their stories. So the Pathans, all the recruitment orders have gone out. Now the Pathans have to cross this river Indus, which in August is in full flood, in monsoon, and they have to reach the ports of Bombay and Calcutta. Bombay and Karachi, sorry. So in their ranks, of course, Khudadat Khan and Mir Dast. Apart from the Pathans, we, of course, have the Sikhs. And you're familiar with the Sikhs. So this is going to be the story I will tell you about Manta Singh. He's the man in the center, and his captain next to him is Captain Henderson. Manta Singh was from Ludhiana in Punjab. He's from the 15th Sikhs, and he's going to set out for this war as well. And of course, along with the Sikhs, we have the Gurkhas. They're famous for their bravery. In Britain, we are all familiar with the Gurkhas. They came down from the hills of Nepal. They had the famous kukri and the war cry. Now, when the Gurkhas come down from the hills and they reach the port of Bombay, they had never seen the sea. They'd never bathed in salt water. It was a whole different world for them. I mean, just coming to Bombay was a different world. And the people in Bombay, they hadn't seen Gurkhas either. They thought they were Japanese. And so there is, the Gurkhas went on route marches and settled in, and soon they were also going to sail from there. Now, the Hindus in India at this time, they did not sail the seas. The seas were called Kala Pani, or the black waters. And the Hindus believed that if you crossed the Kala Pani, these black waters, you would lose your faith. You had to be purified if you crossed these backwaters. But this is the first time, and the Gurkhas are also Hindus, they're staunch Hindus. This is the first time they're all going to cross the black waters. So we have the soldiers. Now what else do we need? We've got to have the generals and the Maharajas. So as I said, the Maharajas were raring to go. They were, so we have here, I'll just go for one Maharaja. This is the Maharaja of Bikaner, 6 feet tall. Bikaner is from Rajasthan, so on the west. Absolutely ready for battle. He had his camel regiment, and he writes to the king. The king was a personal friend. He writes to him that, I'd like to go, and I will join the troops. And commanding them is General Wilcox. Now, General James Wilcox, he knew India very well. He's an old India hand. He's born just before the Indian Mutiny. He's trained in Sandhurst. He used to write poetry for his soldiers, Indian soldiers. And so he is highly respected by all the Indian troops. So soon 2 divisions, the Lahore division and the Meerut division, they start making their way. They reach the port cities, Bombay and Karachi, and they're ready to join the British Expeditionary Force. Now, of course, traveling with the Indians was not easy. Taking Indians to battle across the seas was no easy task. Why? Because the Hindus would not eat food cooked by the Muslims. Now, they have different dietary requirements. Hindus would not eat beef, Muslims would not eat pork. They had to have different separate water. Animals had to be slaughtered differently. So along with the Indian army, there is a whole section marching with them, and these people are called the followers. They are the cooks, the cleaners, the water carriers, the sizes, the grooms to look after these mules, bellow blowers, and importantly, kneaders of dough, because you've got to make chapatis, you've got to keep your army marching on its stomach. So we have the cook. And he is making, he is cooking an Indian meal just, probably meters from the trenches. And sadly, many cooks took a bullet as well, and they died in this war. Now, at this time, as they sail out, the Indians actually did not know where they were going. They hadn't been told, so they are on the sea. It's a beautiful, calm sea. The Sikhs on board were, reading their holy books. They're doing their little route marches. The Muslims would go up and pray in the direction of Mecca. And one day, on 30th August, they hear on the wireless that Lord Kitchener has announced in Parliament that the Indians are on their way. And there is this elation in these ships because they feel we are going to fight in our first Western war. We're going to fight shoulder to shoulder with all our white colleagues. And at this time, the spirit is really, really high. So on 26 September, the Indian ships arrive in Marseille. And here they are. You can see these postcards. The troops have arrived. As they disembarked from these ships, the French had never seen men like them before, in these turbans, all of them different turbans, in fact. And they would just call them all. They would, cheer for them as they got off because they'd come to fight their war. And they would call them Le Hindu. Some of the Sikh soldiers, while they're marching, women wanted to go and kiss them and give them flowers, much to the embarrassment of those men there. So as they marched, they, for the first time, they were being cheered by the locals. And so the Indian troops, they felt pretty pleased. And they replied with the only thing that they knew, which they'd learned from their officers. They replied saying, hip hip hurrah, to Ottoman. And so it went on. And even these followers, this bedraggled looking lot, the cooks, the cleaners, I mean, they've just come off the ship, but they look like they fought, wars already. Well, they were cheered as well. So among them is one person whose story I will tell you later, a person called Sukha. But this is September, October. It is cold. The autumn months are setting in. It's cold. But you can see what they're wearing. The Indians had arrived in their cotton khakis. Desperately, as they went to these fields and camps, they were wrapping themselves in tablecloths, eiderdowns, anything to keep warm. And the French, they watched them in amazement as they went to the camps. So here we have some pictures. They watched them as, the Sikhs combed their long hair, and all these chapatis and dal was being cooked on campsite stoves. Then, of course, we have separate slaughter facilities were set up for the Hindus and the Muslims. And suddenly the French countryside was transformed by the Indians. Here you can see, there's a little boy, he's carrying a sheep for slaughter. Now, the Indians preferred goat. So there was actually a message from the king saying, try to get goat if you can, which was, not really possible. So they had to eat sheep. Of course, they went in trains to their camps. And you can see this journey. Here they are standing. This looks like a station somewhere in India. And here again, I mean, who would think this is France? They go about their ways. Here they're having a wash on the train tracks. And they are all going either to the camps and where they are billeted for a while. Now, in these camps, the Indians, they pray. Here's the Sikh soldiers. They've turned this makeshift barn into a little temple. They're all praying. They play with the locals. Here you can see another soldiers playing with a little boy. And they even tasted some wine. So here you go. But when we see these photographs, we have to remember that these are photos taken for propaganda purposes. The soldiers were not going there to drink wine and have a good time. And in fact, if you look carefully at this picture, I just love this postcard. The landlady of this pub looks very happy. She's got the wine. But if you look at the expressions of the two Indian soldiers, I mean, this man is holding this wine glass. He's kind of frozen. And the other one looks terrified as well. So the only two having a good time is the English soldier and the landlady. So these photos were taken for propaganda that, we are looking after them. They're having a good time. But of course, they hadn't gone there, as we know, to drink wine. Soon it's time for them to move to the front line. And there are Red London buses as well that take them there. So you can see them. Soon they arrive in Belgium, and the Gurkha regiments arrive, and they take up their positions in the trenches and in Ypres in Belgium. And you can see this is October, and they are still in their cotton khaki uniforms. It is cold, it is freezing. And the Indians are now thrown into the deep end. They've never done trench warfare before. They find themselves in the first battle of Ypres, defending the British line. So there's not enough barbed wire, not enough ammunition, and not enough troops. The trenches get flooded. There is rain, as we know, constant rain. The trenches were shallow at this time. They get flooded. They're filled with water and mud. And all the while, this German shells are raining down on them. Now, the Indians had never seen warfare like this. They had had traditional warfare in Afghanistan, clash of steel, swords, muskets and guns, but not faced artillery fire, and definitely not in this weather. So on a cold, damp day in October, but despite all this, they held on. On a cold, damp day in October, when all the men from his regiment were killed, Sipai Khudadat Khan kept firing till his last bullet was over. And he held his trench till reinforcements arrived. And he became the first Indian to win the Victoria Cross. So the action of the Indians allowed the British to actually hold the line in Ypres. If the Indians hadn't held the line, the Germans would have reached the sea, which was their aim. So, they played a really crucial part in the first battle of Ypres. Now, meanwhile, in France, in the south, the Garhwalis and the Sikhs were in action in Neuve-Chapelle and Festubert. So here you can see they're digging the trenches, and the Garhwalis, this is on the road. Now, the Garhwalis were fierce fighters. And as I said, Garwan Singh Negi of the Garhwal Regiment won the second Victoria Cross for the Indians in Festubert. So December, we have the second one. This is just a painting of him getting this cross. So this man from the hills is awarded the Victoria Cross, and he's presented the medal personally by King George V, who comes to Lokon to give it to him. And the king, if anyone was awarded the Victoria Cross, the king would ask them for some wish that he would grant. What is your wish? So Garwan Singh Negi, he doesn't ask for land, he doesn't ask for money. All he says is, I want you to build a school in the hills. Because he'd realized that, literacy was important. His few weeks in France had taught him that he himself was illiterate. Now, most of these people were peasants, as you saw where they'd come from, the raw stock. They were illiterate when they came. And he realized the importance of being educated. So all he asked for was a school to be built. And the school was built, and the school still exists. It is now a secondary school. By November, the Indians have had their first sight of snow. Still without greatcoats. These greatcoats had not arrived. They braved their first winter in the cold and muddy trenches. And these are the letters they wrote home. In the trench, the snow rises from the feet to the neck, and the feet and hands are frostbitten. It rains and snows day and night, wrote a soldier. Another lamented, the whole world is being sacrificed, and there is no cession. It is not a war, but a Mahabharat. Now, Mahabharat is this big Indian epic, which is about a war. So they were relating this war to, their own reality. They said, this is a Mahabharat. And ironically, the Mahabharat is also a war. The big war is between cousins who are at war. And here we have the First World War. Cousins were at war. And the Indian soldiers would find it really difficult to understand, why were white men fighting white men? Why were Christians fighting with Christians? But all they knew is they had to fight for the king. And also their village. The loyalty to the village was very important. So a brief respite over Christmas, a fresh offensive is planned for the new year. So we move into 1915. And this is a big battle that happens, the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March. This would be the first battle where the entire Indian Corps would actually fight together. And this is Neuve-Chapelle, 1915. It was also the first time that the Indians broke through the German defenses. And when we say broke through, it's a few meters. But the First World War was just that, gain a few meters and you gained something, that was your victory. But of course, in Neuve-Chapelle, the casualties are enormous. In just 3 days of fighting, 4,233 Indians were dead. Now, Gabbar Singh Negi, one of the photos I showed you earlier, of the Garhwal Regiment, would fight to the last and die on the battlefield. And he was posthumously also awarded the Victoria Cross. Gabbar Singh came from the village in Garhwal. So the news reaches Garhwal, this remote village, and I've actually been to that village. His 14-year-old, he had a child bride, as they did those. He was barely 20. His bride was 14 years old. Her name was Saturi. She's given this news. And she also is told that he's been awarded the Victoria Cross. And so his family told me that she never remarried, but she would wear the Victoria Cross pinned to her sari all her life. And she would go, she lived her life. She would go to the mountains picking the logs, carrying it on her head. And she would be there wearing the Victoria Cross. And all the Garhwalis in the village would stand up and salute her because they knew how important that Victoria Cross was. She lived to a ripe old age. Sorry, this is just a painting. We don't even have a picture of him, but we have a painting of Gabbar Singh Negi. And this is Saturi Devi. You can see she's wearing all the medals. She lived till her 80s. And this is a memorial that was built in the village in Chamba. And she would take the salute at this event. And this fair happens on his birthday, even now, in this little village. It's used as a recruitment for the Garhwal Regiment, which still exists in India. Now, in Neuve-Chapelle, there's another story of sacrifice. And I'm going to tell you the story of Manta Singh. So Manta Singh, the Sikh man in the center, he's from the 15th Ludhiana Sikhs, and he goes with his friend, who's standing next to him on his right, Captain George Henderson. So while this Battle of Neuve-Chapelle is on, he sees that George Henderson has been injured. He doesn't think twice. He runs there. He takes a wheelbarrow, runs onto the field, picks up his captain, bringing him back. But of course, he gets a bullet as well in his leg. Now, both Manta Singh and George Henderson are brought back to Brighton to recover. But Manta Singh's injuries are very high, and his leg is amputated. He says, I'm a farmer, what will I do? And, well, he dies. So he passes away. But that's not the end of the story. George Henderson survives. So George Henderson knows that he owes his life to Manta Singh. So when he goes back after the war, he makes sure that Manta Singh's son also joins the regiment. And in the Second World War, Manta Singh's son and George Henderson's son, they both go out and they fight in Africa together. And it doesn't end there either, because the third generation, they live here in the UK, and they meet at this Chhatri, which all of you know. So Jaimal Johal and Ian Henderson, every year when they have the service in the Chhatri, they go there and lay a wreath. So this is a friendship formed, on the fields of battle, really, but as a friendship that has gone through 3 generations. So for me, I'm not a military historian, so the battles don't interest me as much as the personal stories do. But of course, this war is drawing on, and the soldiers write home. Now, as I said, they write about the horrors of war, and there's another letter here. No one who has ever seen the war will forget it to their last day, wrote a Pathan soldier. Just like a turnip is cut into pieces, so a man is blown to bits by the explosion of a shell. All those who came with me have ceased to exist. You can see in fact, the haunted faces of these soldiers by now. All the, enthusiasm with which they had come to this Western battle is just drained now. And in April 1915, they face the first German gas attack in Ypres. And they are told to just tie, they're not prepared for this gas. So the Indian soldiers were told to tie their turban around their face. And that was their protection. They were actually told to urinate on their turbans and tie those around your face. They didn't yet have gas masks. And so the other person, now for his bravery in the face of the gas attack, where he runs and rescues his comrades, though he himself is badly injured, is Mirdast, a Pathan who is now awarded the Victoria Cross. So here he is. He's also brought back to Brighton to recover, but he was in a very bad state. He was on a wheelchair, but he was presented his medal on the grounds of the Brighton Pavilion by King George V. And he says he's going to stand up to receive his award, which he does. And then, of course, he's asked the same question, what would you like? What can we give you? And Mirdast's request was also quite sad. He says, all the Indian soldiers who have been injured should not be sent back to the front line. He said they should be allowed to go back home. They've done their job. And that's what his request was. Because by now, the Indians were writing desperately. They'd been away. They just felt they were never going to return to India. And they would write that unless we lose an eye or a leg, we'll never see our homeland again. So this desperation was growing. So, of course, when they were brought here to the hospitals, they'd be patched up. And then if they were okay, they'd be sent back. So his request was, please don't send them back, which, of course, they was not listened to. So now, as we know, all the injured were brought in, many of the injured were brought in here to England, to this neighborhood, to Brighton, where they were kept in the pavilion. Now, this was converted into a hospital for the Indian soldiers. Now, suddenly the soldiers, after the trenches, they lay under these grand chandeliers, and they were, in this palace, relaxed in the crowns. One soldier remarked that he is in heaven. I mean, no wonder. But of course, the thing is, these photos were also taken and used as propaganda because they were turned into a booklet. Now, the king and queen also came to Brighton, met the injured soldiers. Everything became used as a publicity tool. So 20,000 copies of these photographs were printed in a brochure was printed with all these photographs, as if they're just lying in palaces, under chandeliers, or sitting around having a chat in the grounds. And these were sent back to India to recruit more soldiers, which of course was, just a lie, really, because this is not what their life was. These were the lucky ones who had actually survived. So they came, the king and queen came to visit, more pictures of Brighton. And but the other thing is the dome is also converted into a hospital. But the other dark side to this story is that the English nurses were not allowed to nurse the Indian soldiers. So no good English ladies visit them. And in fact, when you go to the exhibition, there is this lovely letter that you brought out, which is saying, instructions that English women must not hold the hands of the soldiers. So the English did not want, which was, refuted by others. So, the other side is also there. But the English did not want any liaisons happening between white English women, lonely white English women, and lonely injured Indian men. So they were kept under very tight supervision. The Kitchener Hospital was the largest hospital in Brighton, and it was surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. And so in one of the letters, one of the soldiers writes that it's Kitchener jail, I am here. The Indians were taken out for walks under close supervision, and only once in a few weeks. So their turn would come probably in a few months' time. So it led to protests. There's even a shootout at the hospital. And as I said, one of them called it Kitchener Jail. Now, the other slightly dark, very dark side is that children as young as 10 were taken to the front line. And I found this in, again, the files. And it is actually the English commanders commenting on why are these children in the hospital, because they've got injured. So they went as bellow blowers and kneaders of dough. So these were probably, they probably lied about their age, but you can see if a child is 10 years old saying he's 17. They got through. And here in Brighton, we have a photo of this young soldier, Gurkha soldier, Pim. His hands and legs have been blown off. He was 16, and the Queen noticed him and gave him a rose. So he's holding this rose. And again, it becomes propaganda because, the Queen has given him a red rose. But of course, there was no reason for him to have been there in the first place. And he's there with his other brothers. Everybody's injured. But of course, the British wanted to make sure that everyone is happy and they don't have a mutiny on their hands. So a lot of care was taken to see that all the religious practices are followed, that the soldiers get what they want. So separate slaughterhouses are set up. As you can see, very canny butcher in Brighton set up probably the first halal shop. He's labeled it Hindu meat house and Mohammedan meat house. They're also taken on outings in open-top buses. So, they're very visible and people can cheer for them and it would just lift their spirit. But despite all these arrangements and the bright lights of Brighton and the hospital care, the soldiers were depressed. A Gurkha soldier committed suicide at the Kitchener Hospital. In letter after letter, the soldiers spoke of their longing to go home and their despair that they would be sent back to the trenches. So one of the letters is, "For God's sake, don't come to this war in Europe. Tell my brother, for God's sake, not to enlist." As I said before, all those, they thought that unless they lost an arm or a leg, they would not return to India. Now, by the end of 1915, most of the infantry was sent to Mesopotamia, Palestine, North Africa. So they wound up their operations here. So suddenly from the cold and the winter, they were going to go to a desert and suffer those harsh conditions. The cavalry, the sappers, miners, they stayed behind. Now, they would watch their British counterparts go on leave because, everyone was allowed leave, but the Indians were not allowed any leave because the long sea journey, they had no ships to spare to send them. So they stayed the length without holiday, without a little break. And some stayed on for 4 years, 5 years. The sappers stayed on after the war was over. So the Indians played their part in the infamous Battle of Somme, which began on the 1st of July, 1916. On the first day of battle, they were photographed doffing their hats. Sorry, this is letter writing. First day, there they are doffing their hats. In the first few hours alone, the British lost 20,000 men. 40,000 were seriously injured. Never had such a beautiful summer day seen so many dead. By mid-November, the Battle of Somme was over. The British suffered around 420,000 casualties. Total number of dead was 1.3 million. Now, while the Indian infantry were fighting in the trenches, the first Indian pilots were taking on the Germans in the air. And this is something I really didn't know when I started researching the book, that we had Indian pilots in the First World War. I knew about the Indian pilots in the Second World War, but not about the First World War. So here we are. Here's a little look at the pilots. So that's Hardeep Singh Malik, the very dapper Sikh, and Indralal Roy. Hardeep Singh Malik. Now, the background to the pilots is actually very different because they are from elite families. They are men who've, go to school here. Hardeep Singh Malik went to Oxford. He's an Oxford Blue. Indralal Roy was the son of a senior judge. He was here. He studied in St. Paul's School in Kensington. So they are from a different class of Indians. And Hardeep Singh Malik, he becomes the first Indian pilot to join the Royal Flying Corps. Now, he had graduated from Oxford, but he had to fight a lot of prejudice to get in there because Indians were not allowed to be officers. And if you were in the Air Force, you had to be an officer. So he was not allowed. And he was determined he was going to join the Air Force. So he puts up a fight. He says, okay, I'll go join the French. He goes off and drives ambulances. And his tutor in Oxford, he says that this is ridiculous. The French are ready to take him. And he says, this is ridiculous that we are not using men like Hardeep Singh Malik. And so he is recruited and he becomes the first to fly. And of course, Malik opens the doors. So following him is this 18-year-old. Indralal Roy had just finished school. He'd got a place in Cambridge, but all he wants to do is become a pilot, and he signs up. So Laddie, of course, is young. He's a teenager. He's full of youthful verve, energy. He was very popular in the mess. He would get up on the table, and he would, all he wanted to do was bring down German aircraft. And he also enjoyed sketching. He loved sketching. And between the 9th of July and the 19th of July, Laddie took down 9 German aircraft, becoming India's first flying ace. He is only 18 at this stage. And he would sketch these ships. But it was, to end all too soon for Laddie. While flying a dangerous mission in France on 22nd July, so just a few days back, all those years ago, his plane was attacked by 4 German planes and a dogfight followed. His plane was shot, but Laddie, being Laddie, took down 2 more planes as he was going down. And he was only 19. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, which is the highest Air Force sort of award. And he was the first Indian to receive this award. Now, less than 3 months after Laddie died on the skies over France, the war was over. Over 73,000 Indians had died in the war. Hundreds of thousands were seriously wounded, returned to India, their lives damaged forever. Now, to acknowledge the contribution of the Indians in the war, they were allowed to attend the Imperial War Cabinet in London and the peace talks in Paris in 1919. So, attending the cabinet are 2 Indians. One you'll recognize from the photos, the Maharaja of Bikaner in uniform standing at the back. He represented the princely states of India. And there is another very, very soft-spoken demure man called Lord Sinha. He was the first Indian in the House of Lords, and he represented the constituent assemblies. Now, India had secured its place on the high table, but what they wanted, what had happened to South Africa, they wanted dominion status. They thought, by fighting in this war, by sacrificing our lives, we would get what the other colonies got, which is what happened to Canada, South Africa, Australia. But of course, that is not to happen. So the Treaty of Versailles, the Maharaja, is actually, again, something I didn't know. He is one of the signatories on the Treaty of Versailles, representing India. So there was a little debate about who should sign, Sinha or the Maharaja. But of course, the king said the Maharaja because he was a friend. So the Maharaja got his signature, and poor Sinha just stood in the background. But you can see his stance. He was 6 feet tall. He really lived up to that flamboyant Maharaja image. He always stayed at the Savoy. Sinha would stay in a small hotel somewhere else. This painting hangs in the Imperial War Museum, and of course you can see the Maharaja there. Now, India had backed the war effort for dominion status, which they didn't get. And not only did they get that, barely 5 months into the end of the war, April 1919, they receive a slap on the face, because this happens in Amritsar. It's the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which many of you know. This is the holiest day of the Sikhs. It's the 13th of April. It's their New Year day. And the Golden Temple in Amritsar is where they've all gathered. And there was a little park next to it called Jallianwala Bagh, Jallianwala Garden. And they've all gone there. But a curfew had been imposed because there was a lot of political unrest. I'm not going into the details now, but after the war, there's a lot of political unrest. So meetings had been banned. It was a Rowlatt Act which had banned meetings, and curfew had been imposed. But most people didn't know there was a curfew because, this is the day they go to the temple, and they're all at this park. And then, many of us know this, but I'll say it again. So General Dyer, he's the one who would impose the curfew. He enters Jallianwala Bagh with his troops, and Jallianwala Bagh was a place, was a little park which is surrounded on three sides. So there's only one entrance, one gate, and the entrance was a narrow corridor, probably that big. And so he comes in, his troops surround the whole place, they block the entrance, which is also the exit, and then he orders them to fire. Sitting in the crowd were women, children, men, Sikhs. It was their holiest day. And also, and not just Sikhs, there were other Indians as well. And Sikhs and the region of Punjab had contributed the most to this war. They had the biggest number of troops. So instead of, giving them awards and giving them what they wanted, they got fired at. Dyer ordered his men to continue firing till the last bullet was over. And of course, the official figures were something like 300 and something dead, but it was over 1,000 dead. And what happened afterwards was even worse. So this was an act, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, one of the darkest periods of British Indian history, turned the tide in India. So the poet, the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore, he returns his knighthood in protest. And the Indian freedom movement now goes up. The gear shifts. It's absolutely moving into third gear from now on. And of course, there's another thing that happened. As the ships came back after the war, 2 soldiers on these ships had a bad cold, and they were carrying the Spanish flu. They landed in Bombay, and this flu spread. By the time the whole ship was infected, Bombay and Madras and Calcutta, the cities were it just spread through, killing millions. More than died in the war, died with the Spanish flu. So political unrest, economic crisis, all of this happens after the war. And suddenly these soldiers who had limped back, missing arms and legs, they've been forgotten. Things have moved on. It's the freedom fighters that people are thinking about. The new heroes were those who are fighting for independence. So they were forgotten by both places, I would say, by Britain, and after independence, by India as well. But a few villages in India and Pakistan remember them. So this is Garhwal Rifles in Lansdowne, which is the recruiting center. And as you drive up, it's on a hill. As you drive up, you have these photos saying this regiment had these Victoria Cross winners. And in Pakistan, you have this sign pointing to the village of Khudadat Khan. The names of the Indian dead are written in this memorial at the Neuve-Chapelle in Paris, which was the site of the big battle where over 4,000 died. It's a beautiful memorial. They're also recorded, of course, in Bedford House Cemetery, in the Menin Gate in Ypres, and you can probably see the names. It's the front gate has the names across the panel of all the Indian soldiers, and you can see them there. Now, those who died in England, of course, are remembered here. So we have the graves of the Muslim soldiers in Brookwood, in the Chatri Memorial in Patcham Downs near Brighton. This was where the Hindus and Sikhs were cremated. So this memorial was built for them, and there is an event every June. This was a sort of Indian-style Chhatri that was built there. And of course, very local, we have the story of Sukha in Brockenhurst. And I have to tell Sukha's story because I found Sukha's case in the hospital files in the British Library. And it came up because, well, Sukha was a cleaner. He'd volunteered in India, and he was what was called an untouchable. So he was, the caste system in India meant he was the lowest of the low, described as untouchable. So he had the job of cleaning the toilets, cleaning the mule, all this left by the mules. And he cleans the trenches, and then he's brought here to clean the hospitals in Brockenhurst. And Sukha falls ill, and then Sukha dies. He has pneumonia. By 1915 January, Sukha is dead. But that's not the end of his story. So these hospital files, they don't know what to do with Sukha. Because first they send him to Patcham, to the Hindus, and they say, cremate him. And the Hindus there say, no, we can't cremate Sukha because he's an untouchable. And then they send him to the Muslims. So they were being buried in Woking. And the Imam of the Woking mosque says, no, we can't bury Sukha because he's not a Muslim. So Sukha is lying in no man's land. He's rejected by his own country people. So Sukha's story really, and they don't know what to do with him until the vicar of Brockenhurst, the St. Nicholas Church, he comes forward and he says, Sukha died for us, so we will bury Sukha. And many of you have probably seen his grave. He's buried here. And the money was raised by the parishioners. That's his whole life story is probably written on that stone. So he doesn't even have a second name. He's just called Sukha. And in the Commonwealth, the register they have of the dead, he's registered as Sukha Kallu. Now, Sukha Kallu doesn't mean anything. It just means black. I mean, he's probably dark skinned and they just called him Darky or something. So he doesn't even have a second name, and he's buried there. But at least Sukha got a good farewell, and I think he's lying in a very nice place. And people go to see his grave. They send me pictures. His story was, this story was picked up by the BBC, so it went around. And we don't have a face to Sukha, but I think it just shows the human stories of this war is there in this grave. So there were other followers as well, all those men I said, the cooks and cleaners. Sukha is the story of one of the cleaners. These are others. And again, they just have one name, Hansa, cook, Babu, a cook or a cleaner. So, but they're all there. They all took a bullet, making chapatis, God knows what, and they died there. Now, few visit these graves because they're very far away from India. Most of the families still live in the villages. So at the Indian Memorial, this is in Neuf-Chapelle, the day I went, it's got the names of 4,000 dead, but there's nobody ever there. Sometimes once a year, a formal mission will come from the Indian High Commission, or sometimes I think Sikhs from Gurdwaras are taken there, but it's usually just empty, tended very beautifully by the gardeners from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And the day I visited, there was a single one wreath, and it said the words, "Our shared future is built on our shared past," which I thought was lovely. So here we are, over 100 years now after the Great War. I hope I've been able to revive some of the stories, give you an idea of what happened when these men came to fight, as I said, for king and another country. And of course, we have beautiful local stories today from this area, which you'll see in the exhibition, many of which I didn't know. I mean, I thought it was a real treasure trove there. So thank you for that. And do go see that. And yeah, tell the story to others that these people did come here. Thank you.
Shubhani, thank you. You're okay to take a few questions?
Of course,
I'm going to exercise my prerogative and ask the first question, which is a very simple one. It's a terminology one. The term sepoy, is that a peculiarly East India Company Empire word that might be regarded as derogatory now?
It comes from the Hindi word sipahi, which is a Hindi word, and then of course it became sepoy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in the context of the Raj, you understand it. Nobody would be called a sepoy anymore.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Take a few questions now. We don't have a roving mic, so if I give you the chance to ask a question, if you could try and speak up, that'd be fantastic. So first question.
Thank you very much for a fascinating story.
You're welcome.
Is any of this wonderful story recorded anywhere in either Indian museums or by the regiments in any sort of major way for the population to see?
Sadly, in India, no. The Air Force Museum in Delhi has a little bit of Hardeep Singh Malik and the sketches of Indralal Roy. But that's just the Air Force Museum. But after this book was written, there's very little awareness in India as well. You see, even I grew up in India and I didn't know the extent of involvement. But after the centenary, after my book was published, and I went around in India, there was a lot of interest. So now there are a lot of institutions which are trying to keep oral histories. So hopefully, and a few books since mine was published in 2015, and so a few more books have appeared since then about the First World War. So there is interest, but no, definitely not enough.
Yes.
Did the Maharajas bring their camels over here or not?
So the camels went when he was fighting in Egypt. He led a charge himself, Gangaram. He led the charge with his camel cavalry. Oh, that's a tongue twister. Yeah, but he did. He led that in Egypt. Yeah.
Someone in the back, yes.
Yeah, the answer to this might be in the exhibition, interesting. But how did the vicar of the church of Brockenhurst find out about the issue with Sukha and the burial?
Because there was a hospital there. So he died in the hospital. They built a hospital for the Indian troops called the Lady Harding Hospital. Yeah, so he died in this hospital. And that's how, yeah, it was.
Yes, very much. So the New Forest isn't really featured in Shravani's talk because we talk about this being much more of a broader scoped talk today. But the exhibition is all about the hospitals that were in the New Forest. There were 3 or 4 hospitals and 2 convalescent depots.
Yeah.
So please,
I mean, I've written about the hospitals, but there's so much more detail here. So I have written about the hospitals in the book as well, about what was served over there, how they sort of categorized the prisoners, then who came to see them, how it started up. So these were temporary. The Lady Harding Hospital was a temporary hospital, so it was literally built to house them. But Brighton Pavilion, they were kept there. I mean, that was obviously permanent structure. And many of the hotels where they went in New Milton and others. But you'll see a lot of that in this exhibition. So, yeah.
one more on this side, yes.
I'm just interested in your returns about the segregation, so that the Indian social herald from the English ladies. I wonder if we'd know anything about whether actually anybody got over the wall or not.
Absolutely. When you have a rule, a rule will be broken. So I'm sure they did. And we have a few letters where he says that this lovely lady invited him for tea, and he went to the house for tea, and he does talk only about the tea, but read through the lines. So there are letters. There were other letters which were heavily censored because they say, oh, the women come for us, all the time. It's like the bazaars of Agra. So those letters never made it. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't like that. They would just have been friendly. But these men have just, the way they read it is that all these women were coming to them. So those were heavily censored, not sent at all. But they did, so we read through the lines in these letters and we can see.
Is it right that if an Indian soldier wanted to see his village would get a gun?
No, one of them got a gun, I think in Pakistan, because it was one of the little villages where
I'm talking a cannon,
Yeah, they actually gave a little cannon, which is there now. Now all the kids just play on top of it. But it's in a village in Pakistan. They were given this cannon for being the village that sent the most people to the war, but also the least number of deaths. So these were valiant. It's a village called Dulmial in Pakistan, and they were given this gun. And just a gun now, lying, a little cannon in the village, and all the street children play on top of it. They don't know what it's there for, but it's there.
It's still there.
It's still there. Yeah. But these other villages, like you had the memorials here, where every village put all the names. So I didn't actually put up a picture. Maybe next time I will. But the villages there, they were given little memorials, which were just a stone, and it would say, from this village, 11 went to the war, 1 returned, or 1 did not return. So they were just numbers, they're not names, and they're not, listed like the villages here.
Yes,
Yeah.
back, Chip.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for dictating, telling us these stories. I think not to just Englishmen, even the Indian people like us who was not even aware of these things. And second, I appreciate you touched some sensitive topics as well, which is not easy to dictate. I think the question is, may I know what inspired you to write about them? What triggered you to write and, investigate about all these soldiers?
Interesting, because I'd written a book about the Second World War. I've done a biography of Noor Inayat Khan. So, the wars had always been of interest to me. And then the trigger for this was that the centenary was coming up. And I knew there'd be so many books, more books about the Battle of the Somme and Passchendaele and everything. But nobody would write anything about the Indians. And I just felt I had to do it. I was carrying this log on my shoulder, tree trunk, and I felt I had to do it. So that was the driving point. So yeah, I was late. I wanted it by 2014, but the research took so long. I went to these villages and then the files, and so I couldn't finish it. But it was published in 2015.
We have 2 more questions now. Devanshi.
Thank you so much for the lovely talk. And I guess just a follow-up question to the one that was just asked was that, we appreciate all of us that this is a very complex and complicated topic. So while you were writing or while you were researching this, I'm sure that you might have come across some very challenging stories as well. So just wondering what your thought process was when you came across those. How did you perhaps position yourself also as a journalist, keeping that objective point of view, but also, as you said, carrying this massive log of the truth?
Absolutely. Well, it wasn't difficult really, because as I said, I just told the truth. Where there was something wrong, like a 10-year-old coming in, I put it there, and these were, it's researched. So these are comments coming from the English soldiers themselves, from the generals themselves, saying, why is there a 10-year-old in this hospital? So I could quote this. And I was as objective. I mean, even to this day, I say, how much racism did they find? I said, what, in all those letters, I did not find where they are complaining about racism, because their officers were always, the English officers who accompanied them were always from India, and they had to speak the language. They were taught Hindustani. And so they usually had a good relation. And they were kept, they weren't fighting with the other Tommies. So, we're not seeing much interaction. So though I went through hundreds of thousands of letters, they are in the British Library, all these letters went through the censor board, and so which is why we have them. They translated them, censored them. Those that didn't go are there, those that went are there, and we know exactly what was censored. So it was interesting to see. I mean, there are the complaints, the title of your exhibition, Red Pepper, Black Pepper, that is, for those who don't know, I mean, that was a code used by the soldiers. So they would write to each other because they knew the letters are being censored, and they would write in code. So red pepper, lots of red pepper lost today. And the black pepper is being sacrificed. They would say black pepper were the Indian soldiers and the red pepper has survived. So that was theirs. But they didn't know that, of course, the British censors, they knew very well that about the codes. So they were just watching them, and they comment that, oh yeah, they're trying to get away using these codes, but we know what they're up to. But they did try, so that was their code.
Last question. Yes.
Just a piece of information people might like to know, I know quite a few people know, but in Brockenhurst Church we do have a small exhibition about the Indians. I know the museum does stay slightly longer, but we do have, and we have quite a lot of information about the Indians. So.
That's nice to know.
If I may, I would like to thank you very much, because I am from the Chapelle area, and I came to visit my friends and found out. That's the Nicholas Church.
Well, we're all connected in so many ways, so.
Just before we wrap up, and it's not really a question, but Shravani, when we were talking earlier, I asked you about your recent trip to Austria to talk to a group of German and continental historians. It was a really interesting conversation we had, because you were explaining to me some German information that was being discussed there. Everyone might just be interested to know a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the German academics I mentioned this German, the prisoners of war camp, they're mentioned in my book, but briefly. And at this conference, this was at the University of Vienna, we had some German historians who had worked on the prisoner of war camps in Germany. So these were just outside Berlin. And so in these camps, they built a mosque because they thought they would try to recruit the Indian Muslims, take them onto their side. They succeeded with one person. He was Mir Mas. He's a brother of Mir Das. I won't go into the story, but it's in the book. The two brothers, Mir Das got the award, the VC, and Mir Mast crossed in Neuve-Chapelle. So lots of things happened in Neuve-Chapelle. But so they did get a few, but most stayed loyal. But apart from that, there were these anthropologists who found, because in the Indians, as I said, there's such a mix of ethnicity, language. So they wanted to record them for academic reasons. So these prisoners of war were brought to this room, and these shellac recordings were made, which they still have copies of. They've digitized them. And, like a Gurkha soldier, he's made to stand in front of a funnel and just talk into it. And they were told, say anything you like, because he wanted to record their culture, their history, their voices, everything, their language. And so there's a recording of a Gurkha soldier who's telling ghost stories. And he's saying this in Nepali, and you can hear him. And I actually spent my childhood in Nepal, so I can follow some of it. It was incredible. But he's also so clever. He's talking about ghosts. He says, no, you go in the jungle and the ghost is there and it's hanging. But who are these ghosts? They are the people who've not been, who haven't had a normal death and haven't been buried properly or cremated properly. So what is he? He's actually referring to those of his colleagues who have died in the fields. And for the Hindus, cremation was important. So if you're buried, your soul may not have been, whatever. It's a disturbed soul. So he's also referring to in an oblique way to his colleagues. You have some stories like that. Then you have this Indian soldier. He's probably just 21, Mal Singh. I write about him in the book. And all he's doing is wailing. It's this wail that he wants butter. He says the butter in India is better and the butter here is terrible. And I really wanted to follow up. I want to go back to India and the butter is better. And then I really wanted to follow up whether he actually made it back. But I tried hard, and I think I found his name in one of the prisoner of war camp dead, and I think he never made it back, never got his butter. So they're, these really sad stories, but they recorded them, and these recordings are there. And also they filmed, for propaganda purposes. So these Indians doing this crazy dance, crazier than anything I've ever seen in India, because they sort of exaggerated it, and then the Gurkhas, because the Gurkhas were staunch Hindus, they would sacrifice for the Shera, which is it's one of their festivals. They would sacrifice a goat. And so they're allowed to do this. So you have these scenes of these Gurkha priests, and they're going to, this poor little goat has come, and he's, a big thing has been put on his head, and he's going to be sacrificed, and everyone's going, oh. So it's all very bizarre scenes, but they filmed all this. But I think they set it up, it doesn't look real at all, some of it. But that's how it was.
We show our appreciation for